Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. As always, Adam Tooze, FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor, is with us in New York. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So I say as always because I'm used to saying that, but of course Adam was out for several weeks. We had pre-recorded some podcasts, so listeners may have enjoyed those on Heterodox Economists. But I think I speak for everyone listening to the podcast, but also here in-house at FP, that we are happy to have Adam back, still recovering from his surgery in December, but willing and able to do the podcast again. Nice having you back, Adam.
Yeah, it's absolutely great to be here.
So we actually just have one data point for you all today, one topic that we wanted to discuss, and that data point is 1968, which is the year that the photograph Earthrise was taken by the astronaut William Anders.
We are now approaching lunar sunrise, and for all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face
That
of the deep.
photograph famously depicts the planet Earth as seen from space near the surface of the moon, and that image of the Earth as a whole triggered resurgence of environmental ideas. Some have even said that the photograph marks the beginning of the environmental movement. And even if that's an exaggeration, it definitely coincided with a resurgence of ecological thought, including the Gaia hypothesis developed by the British chemist James Lovelock, which emphasized life on Earth being the product of a kind of delicate balance of systems that make life possible, and that humans have a responsibility to maintain. These ecological ideas now are seeing a kind of new resurgence, most recently in the form of a concept called the planetary. This is a concept that has been taken up very strongly by a think tank called the Berggruen Institute. They recently held a big conference in Venice called the Planetary Summit, in which they expanded some of these ecological ideas to include some cosmological perspectives, some new developments in technology and natural science. Altogether, they drew in philosophers, political theorists, policymakers, and astrobiologists and artists, etc., to kind of unpack what Nils Gilman, the chief operating officer of the Berggruen Institute, calls a techno-scientific object, a philosophical event, a call to new forms of governance. All this falls under the category of the planetary. So we thought we'd take this idea and try to explore it from an economic perspective, as we often do. And to start off with, Adam, the planetary concept, as Berggruen describes it, they trace it back to the work of an Indian historian, Dipesh Chakrabarty, and a book he wrote called The Climate of History in a Planetary Age. And as I was reflecting on the planetary and its relationship to ecological thought, I'm curious what exactly differentiates this planetary perspective from the ecological perspective that's already been in circulation. You know, this idea of living in harmony with the planet and its systems has already been around. So, yeah, what sort of new developments are taking place in this new concept?
I mean, I think your reference to the 60s and to the Earthrise image of 68 is crucial. And I think rather than trying to argue for the planetary as a novel concept against that background, I think it's better perhaps to think of it as the long conceptual working through, half-century long working through, of the awesome shock of seeing that image, right? It's the confrontation of humanity with the planet that we live on from the outside. And there was also then the blue marble image of 1972. In fact, the very first images of the edge of the planetary envelope were taken by firing German World War II V-2 rockets vertically into space and attaching cameras to the nose cone to actually get an image of the outer edge of the Earth's atmosphere. So the program of space exploration in the end offers us a view of our planet that is radically novel in that it is no longer in itself bound to the ground. And concepts of the planetary that have evolved over the recent decades are all efforts to come to terms not necessarily with the specific science of ecology, which can, after all, be intensely local. I'm looking out at, a backyard in New York with birds, pigeons, dirty old pigeons flying around a bunch of scraggly trees. There's an ecology there. But what the planetary captures is the sense of this holistic interconnection on this given singular rock that we inhabit, that itself is washed with water and is so beautiful when seen from the outside. And it comes in different permutations. In fact, the first use of planetarity was by another Indian social theorist, which Gayatri Spivak, who's my colleague at Columbia, a literary theorist, post-colonial literary theorist, who actually coined the term as a kind of antagonistic term. And I think this is another key thing about thinking in terms of the planetary. Thinking in terms of the planetary is not just an effort to think the whole, to think the awesome implications of us being on this spaceship Earth, but also to think against something else. And in Spivak, for the first time, this is formulated as thinking against, in her case, the colonial vision of the world as globe that inspired the Western exploration and conquest of the planet from the late 15th century onwards. So that vision of the globe as the domain of power, the domain of exploitation, for her, planetarity was a conception of the whole that refused that power blackmail. In other words, there it is, now manage it. There it is, now own it. There it is, control it. There it is, run it, like husband it, manage it, right? Planetarity for Spivak was a way of saying, yes, I see this thing, but no, I refuse. I refuse the power. She, in fact, spoke about praying for planetarity rather than managing it. So this was in 1997. 10 years later in Chakrabarty, the planetary is understood, I think, again in oppositional terms. So for him too, the planetary is not globalization. But in Chakrabarty, what we really see is a mapping of the planetary in which the idea is essentially that we, for the first time, understand that human action on the really large material environmental scale has to be situated alongside other natural forces that are driven by their own logic. In other words, you can't deforest the Amazon without this having blowback effects on you. You can't burn all of the oil and gas and coal that we have discovered under the crust of the earth without utterly changing the climate envelope within which you operate. So this is an oppositional term too in Chakrabarty, but now with an opening towards, if you like, a new science of the planetary, which is associated with ideas like Gaia, right, put into circulation again, about 50 years ago, this idea of the planet as a massively live, interconnected system. And if you look at the folks contributing to the Berkgruen Institute volume, there's a book that came out of that conference, very quickly done. You see a third version, which is associated with rather technocratic visionaries like Benjamin Bratton and people like that, who say, okay, fine, this is true, but we want to put the spaceship, the satellite for which you see this, back into the picture. In other words, okay, fine, we grasp that there is a difference between the global and the planetary, but we also have to think the human development, the evolution, the dialectical progress of humanity, which actually allows us to see this. And if we're able to see it now in a way that we were never able to see it before, there is, as it were, an implication which wraps around in exactly the opposite direction that Spivak originally intended, which in her case was a renunciation of all kind of power and control. And in people like Bratton, the planetary is refigured as the appropriate domain for government, right? This is the level at which now we know, now our power, our knowledge, our technology has taken us into space. How can we not? We can't not know. We can't unknow what we've seen. So this is the challenge that lies in the future. So I think those are the three different ways in which the planetary is being thought right now, as a kind of radical rejection, as a kind of dualism in which we recognize that there is a global, but there is then a planetary logic, which we don't fully control, but which we interact with. And then this third ultimate kind of technocratic vision, which says, and we can't unsee that. And so if we are going to reckon with these natural forces, we have to reckon with them seriously at the appropriate scale. So we need to do geoengineering, and we need to do whatever it takes at the scale of the planet to manage our collective survival.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like then the common normative dimension here is that this planetary concept suggests that we should be living in harmony somehow, right? We should be living in harmony with this planet, that's necessary. And I'm curious whether this concept is ultimately in tension with humanity's capitalist life. I mean, does capitalism as a system of economics, system of interaction, does it ever tend towards homeostasis, to use a biological principle, suited for this planetary idea? I mean, yeah, does capitalism ever tend towards homeostasis as opposed to further growth?
I mean, I think if you started with the Spivak version of this, you'd have an even more radical move, which would be to say, what is the we, which you evoke, Cam, when you say we should be living in homeostasis or whatever, we should be living in balance. The Spivak point is to question what that we is, right? That wants to organize itself and do things better and so on and so forth. Because that ultimately is the power-derived notion of a kind of subjectivity that is struggling to get things right, whereas she is using the planetary as a concept which challenges that very notion. I think in Chakrabarty's reading, there's a kind of open-endedness, to be honest. I'm not sure there's a necessary normative implication. It's just saying, do this and reckon with the consequences. Go on living like this and reckon with the consequences. Go on, destroying biodiversity in the way that you are, and there will be hell to pay. And the planetary is the dimension, is the matrix within which we may or may not be able to calculate what that damage will be. There isn't necessarily a normative implication that we should not, undo. It's just a conceptual category that sits there. On the capitalism point, I mean, the interesting thing about Chakrabarty is that he insists that, and I think, broadly speaking, agree with him, that this is not the ultimate driver here of destabilization is not capitalism per se, unless you adopt a truly baggy and sort of outrageously extended notion of capitalism. What's really the driver here is something akin much closer to development. In other words, the problem here is actually political economy in the most extended sense. Some of the most polluting societies, if not the most polluting societies ever, were Soviet communist era, 1980s, coal-based East European societies, right? Which, there are some people who will say those are state capitalists. I find that very, very unhelpful. Capitalism, on the other hand, can also coincide with various types of involution and collapse type logics, right? Even in Gaza right now, there are processes of exploitation going on as the economy implodes all around. So I think it's actually that developmental impulse which is key. And in a sense, you could take the third position, the Bratton position, as saying, well, given that what's at stake here is more than just capitalism, right? So it's not something that we could even if you could consider reforming capitalism, that in a sense understates the scale of our problem. What's actually at stake here is, as Spivak would insist, something closer to technocracy, modernity, human scientific development, technological development, all of the things which the Spivak version of planetarity is in a sense trying to push against, because it identifies all of those ultimately with Western colonial power. Whereas Bratton would say, I think we just have to own this, right? There's no out, there's no escape from this. And it's only by virtue of those forces, some of them capitalist, but many of them to do largely with the state or coalitions of growth agents, urbanization agents, or whatever that is, coalitions in society, given that that is who we are, if you like. And in Bratton's version, that's how we've evolved. Humanity, this sentient, sapient, is part of development. In a sense, what we have to do as part of evolution is we have to own that. In other words, it is precisely the unhinged dynamic of growth that is what we need to lean into rather than trying to contain it and push back against it. Because that impulse is not outside the logic of development, it's inside the logic of development. That impulse is not outside the logic of evolution, it's inside the logic of evolution. And so the challenge is, as it were, to evolve. And evolving towards planetary terraforming would be, our species' next great move.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, whether evolution is as a biological process is precisely not teleological, though, right? I mean, like, it got me wondering, even, thinking about this concept and attending the conference, that there is something potentially anti-humanist in the planetary concept, in the sense, in the ways that you're describing, I guess, maybe drawing back to Chakrabarti, that from the planet's perspective, it's not necessarily, relevant whether humans manage to figure out a way of living in balance with it, right? The planet will move on.
Latour has this great image of humanity as like a tick, a flea on Gaia's back. And at some point, Gaia will lose patience and just flick us off.
Yeah. I mean, that's clearly not the perspective that reformists would take or would want to take. And I guess maybe to take that perspective in its own terms, if we were to try to think about the planetary from a political perspective, I mean, is it possible to imagine our governance institutions being reformed in a way that would make them more sustainable in this ecological sense? I mean, take the WTO, the trading system, for example. Could that be reformed in a way that makes free trade itself, sustainable from this planetary perspective?
I mean, there are all sorts of proposals in this direction. I mean, they start with, the very boilerplate, Davos, centrist kind of arguments the EU would make, for instance, which it wants carbon pricing all around, right? And it's going to use carbon border adjustments, CBAMs, carbon tariffs, if necessary, to force other people to recognize the externality of CO2 emissions. They want deforestation rules in trade agreements with trading partners. Like, this is the most conventional kind of answer to your question. And then if you dig deeper, of course, there are folks who want to insist on the profound inequality of exchange between the developing and the underdeveloped world, which drives a large part of globalization, because basically the resources of the developing world, of the low-income world, are acquired very cheaply by the rich world. And so this drives globalization of an incredibly unbalanced, unequal, ultimately also unsustainable kind of shape. And so if you could change prices, if we could have a new international division of labor, a new international economic order, this would be a more sustainable form of globalization. So that's kind of, I think, the spectrum of views about globalization and trade. So on the one hand, have a bunch of new helpful rules, and on the other hand, fundamentally change the terms of trade between the resource intensive and rich poor countries, developing countries, and the advanced economies. But I think, standing back from this a little bit further, I'd have to say that, though I understand why you go to globalization and trade as the zone in which to talk about reform, I don't actually think it's the main driver of the ecological challenges that we are seeing around the world, certainly not on the climate side. With deforestation and biodiversity loss, I think the case would be somewhat stronger, because those are classically extractive and about this unequal exchange between the rich world and the developing world. But if you look at CO2 emissions, which are a much more generic kind of environmental damage, right, trade, globalization accounts for a significant but ultimately small part of the overall budget of CO2 emissions globally. And notably in the case of China, only in the early 2000s, before growth really got big, was trade and globalization the driver of China's immense increase in CO2 emissions, which were driven overwhelmingly by coal consumption for the purposes of domestic urbanization. China urbanized 500 million people in the space of a single generation and rebuilt its cities entirely on top of that. And that's what drove the CO2 equation into, the massively dynamic accelerating phase that we've seen in the last couple of decades. And so as long as, and this goes back to the earlier point about development being the core of this, so long as there are hundreds of millions, if not billions of people that still require the basic amenities of modern life, relatively regularized urbanization with proper infrastructure, electric power, and so on. And so long as our means of providing that are basically still the existing technologies of steel production, of cement production, and of generating electric power by burning coal, which hitherto have been the standard kit, whether you're looking in the capitalist West or the Soviet Union and its satellites, or in China or Vietnam for that matter, since the late 1990s and the early 2000s. So long as that equation remains intact, that's essentially the driver of massive imbalance. Not in every respect, like I say, for deforestation, it's a different story. But for CO2 and climate, that's the central driver. And so trade matters, but it can only be one element of a much broader rebalancing that ultimately has to have its root in less planetary and more local dynamics. And in the Chinese case, what's particularly notable is that it is the quite local problem of air pollution as a result of coal burning that ultimately catapulted China towards the most rapid adoption of green power technologies we've ever seen. It's still very much a work in process because the scale of China's coal expansion is so huge, but the rate of adoption is like nothing we've ever seen anywhere else before. And that has to do less with the planetary and more to do with smog, more to do with local phenomena that were very widely experienced also in the West. A big London smog in the 1950s could kill hundreds of people. LA was suffering from smog. Many Indian cities still do today. And so there's a kind of dialectic between the local and the global, which is very important.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break here, but we will be back in a second to continue talking about the Planetary. If we were to then zoom out somewhat, I mean, it does seem like one of the implications of this planetary concept is an interplanetary context, and that's a genuinely new part of this discourse, it seems. There's obviously a growing interest in interplanetary exploration, even settlement. Elon Musk famously has talked about trying to settle Mars as a project. This seems to fall under the category of the planetary in the sense of becoming self-conscious about our planetary life and imagining conditions under which we could find other planets to live in and on. But I'm curious whether this current interplanetary discourse is informed by visions of extraction and colonization primarily, and whether then there could even be a more ecological version of the interplanetary that could be imagined.
I mean, this really is an extraordinary moment when we have, I think we do have to begin to take this stuff seriously. SpaceX is, very, very long past being a joke anymore. It entirely dominates the satellite launch business. It is transforming the sky, literally the night sky around us. We should do an episode on SpaceX in particular. But thinking about the interplanetary dimensions of this, what's really fascinating is that the two oligarch billionaires in the United States who are driving this hardest have really radically different views of the interplanetary future. So the Elon Musk vision really is a planet B vision. So Musk, as far as I understand its idea, is that it is incumbent on us. It's a profound responsibility of the current generation to prepare for the possibility that the Earth will, in one way or another, become uninhabitable. And so, as a backup, and to force the development of technologies that will allow us even further extension of human settlement, we need, with all urgency and with real seriousness, to begin the development of space launch programs that give us a realistic chance of settling Mars. We need to move this from the realm of science fiction to the realm of concrete action. And so they are building these giant heavy lift vehicles, the Starship, which is by far and away the heaviest, biggest rocket that we've ever had at this scale. He wants to assemble a fleet of 1,000 of these, build 100 a year for 10 years. And then in the windows of opportunity when Mars and the Earth are relatively close together, which come around every 26 months, with the bases loaded with 1,000 of these starships waiting in orbit around the Earth, loaded with colonists, then blast off essentially from the edges of the Earth's atmosphere and embark on 3-month journeys to Mars and begin the program of settlement there with a view to establishing a colony of about 1 million people by the 2050s on Mars as our backup space. And obviously on Mars, they will have to rely to a very significant extent on local resources, crucially for the generation of oxygen. But it's that kind of a vision. So plan B for the eventuality that the Earth becomes uninhabitable. Jeff Bezos's vision is radically different. It's utterly fascinating. So Bezos rejects altogether this like pessimistic view of, the end of the Earth as an inhabitable planet. And in fact, his vision is the opposite, which is that the priority has to be to move all the most polluting heavy industrial activities on Earth into orbit around Earth. So for him, the launch pad is the moon, essentially, not Mars. And the idea is to build a series of giant space stations, about 1 million people each in these space stations that will orbit the Earth, harvest the resources that are available to us in the relatively close orbit around the Earth and notably on the moon, develop industrial facilities there so as to make Earth more inhabitable and so as to break the constraint on the human population on Earth, which, is kind of back tapping out at 8 to 9 to 10 billion. And Bezos's vision is that there could be 1 trillion human beings, but clearly not within the limited space of the Earth. And so we need to build, starting between the Earth and the moon, a platform for truly gigantic expansion into space. So they're both billionaires. They both want to leave planet Earth in various ways. They're going to have their own private rocket programs, but they're totally different visions. The Musk vision is a kind of residual plan B backup colony on Mars in the event of really terrible things happening on Earth, whereas the Bezos vision is build out space as a hinterland, a safer, better hinterland for really large-scale expansion of essentially existing human models into space. There's a kind of, around the edges, there's rather different politics as well, I think. They're both edging around issues of constraint. Musk's vision for the politics of the Mars colony is not the same, I think, as Bezos's vision for the politics of these space stations and then the ultimate expansion. But both of them are kind of breaching the planetary envelope, one in a more pessimistic way, a more survivalist kind of vision, the Musk vision, and Bezos is a cornucopian vision, essentially, of endless expansion in a space which is limitless, is no longer constrained.
It's fascinating. I mean, I guess I wonder whether in the Musk version of this, whether he's also drawing any lessons from the destruction that he'd be leaving behind. I mean, would the presumed do-over on Mars follow the same path of development? Is that seen as inevitable, or would there be some kind of, chastened kind of lessons learned after having destroyed one planet?
I honestly don't know whether there's much detail yet on the Mars colony. I mean, the central priorities are going to be, building survivable spaces. So initially, the colonists will actually have to live in the starships, and then if you see the kind of imagery they've developed, you see these mighty rockets that stand in a cluster around then a kind of geodesic dome type structure, which they imagine building, I guess, on Mars, starting. So it's a much, much more far-flung vision in that sense than the Bezos one, because Bezos's vision essentially just involves giant space stations, which are, after all, relatively familiar structures to us, multiplied up to a huge scale, and the moon as your major resource base, whereas Mars obviously poses much, much more serious questions about human survival per se. So I don't know whether there's much, maybe this is something we should dig into more on the political economy, let alone the politics of this imagined space. One thing Musk has said is that not everyone will be able to afford to join, the early waves of space flight to Mars. And so he wants to set up a loan fund so that people will be able to partake. In fact, when push comes to shove and he's asked why he accumulates earthly wealth at the rate that he does, which at this point must, after all, really beg the question of how does anyone need the kind of money that he's got? The part of his answer is, well, I need it for the purpose of realizing this vision and making it accessible to people.
Yeah, this kind of brings me to my last question, which is, related to the fact that this planetary concept seems to include both biological ideas and also cosmological ideas. And I wonder if there's kinds of tension between those as well. I mean, all this discourse about balance, sustainability, homeostasis, harmony, I mean, those are kind of seem to be biological ideas, which are, coherent on their own terms. But then from this cosmological perspective, it seems like the planetary is governed by, if anything, the principle of entropy, right? Kind of like on a physical level, things are just getting more disordered on the most, basic physical level. And, balance and entropy aren't necessarily easily reconcilable. And I'm curious whether entropy itself has its own economic principles involved as well. I mean, does entropy have a natural overlap with capitalism, as we were talking about it before? I guess if you take ever increasing consumption as an idea, that could be an entropic idea, one that doesn't include any natural equilibrium in the system until maybe even some sort of ultimate breakdown. I mean, is entropy maybe the kind of planetary principle the most reconcilable with our current capitalist system?
I mean, if you Google these two terms, there's definitely a considerable body of opinion that would broadly agree with you. And you could see, I don't know, processes like arbitrage, the leveling of prices, the fact that many economic models ultimately tend towards a steady state, which results from the leveling of differences within the system, however those differences are imagined, as being consistent with the laws of thermodynamics and the idea that energy systems will tend ultimately to a state in which all differences are erased. Deeper down in thinking about capitalism, you have folks like George Orwell, who in The Road to Wigan Pier in 1937 wrote this extraordinary passage about the way in which, the ordered civilization, the low entropy world, which we take for granted, ultimately depends on the violent activity of mining coal out of the ground. Millions of years of laid down, sedimented, organic material that become coal. And he writes, practically everything we do, from eating an ice to crossing the Atlantic and from baking a loaf to writing a novel, involves the use of coal, directly or indirectly. But most of the time, of course, we should prefer to forget that they were doing it. It is so with all types of manual work. It keeps us alive and we're oblivious of its existence. It's only because miners sweat their guts out that superior persons can remain superior. All of us really owe the comparative decency of our lives to poor drudges underground, blackened to the eyes with their throats full of coal dust, driving their shovels forward with arms and belly muscles of steel. So there you see in Orwell's vision the way in which, as it were, the comparatively ordered world above the ground depends on this extraordinary expenditure of human effort that is invisible and underground, and ultimately is an entropic process of irreversible, one-way, non-renewable reduction of the highly compressed, highly organized forms of energy that are contained in fossil fuels. I mean, the problem from the ecological point of view is that we kind of may embrace this match, right? We may embrace this match between capitalism and entropy, but I mean, it's life-threatening, right? Because the persistence of life on the planet depends on an opposite process, which is the harnessing at the base level through photosynthesis of the free energy provided to the system from the outside by the radiation of the sun, which is harnessed to organic life through the creation of local low entropy zones, which ultimately then are, of course, unwound because the organic realm too is subject to the laws of thermodynamics. But within that system, our life is the flux of that harnessing of external energy for the purposes of creating lower entropic zones, which then around them, of course, are compensated by various types of new entropy that are created. And ultimately, those reserves of energy through combustion, digestion, breathing, the very act of breathing involves the reversal of that process of, entropy reduction. And we go back to a state of higher entropy. And so, though you could say that there is a sort of natural fit between the physical logical of the world and capitalism, that, there's a natural fit between everything and the physical logic of the world, right? There is no process which isn't subject to this. The real question is, does the current form of capitalism as we know it, does the current form of development, I would insist, as we know it, and this is a rhetorical question, not really an open question, how does it impinge on life? how does it impinge on the life processes, which are also, after all, essential to it? What is development? What is capitalism? Other than in various forms, as Marxian economics would allow you to understand, a harnessing of life and its energies, right? How do those developmental tendencies impact the element, the zone, the space in this flux of energy, of entropy, and high entropy and low entropy? How does it impact that niche within which life exists? That's the question.
Yeah, agreed. And I obviously there are no immediate or ready answers. I can recommend the book put out by the Berggruen folks called The Planetary, but definitely food for thought as we start this new year. And more new episodes ahead. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It's produced by Claudia Tatey, Laura Rossbrow-Tellem, Rob Sachs, and Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested in news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Listeners to Ones and Tooze even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code TOOZE at checkout. That's TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love getting your feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com, or email us, podcast@foreignpolicy.com, or you can tweet us. That's @OnesandTwozePod. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.